Well, howdy there, Internet people, it's Belle again, and welcome to The Roads with Belle. Today is December 11th, 2025, and we're going down the roads to Trump, Monroe, and understanding the link. Recently, the Trump administration released a 33-page document that purported to be a national security strategy. But it really reads like a justification after the fact of what Trump wants to do because of his feelings. In it, it says the U.S. will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe doctrine. I described it as a twisted version of the Monroe doctrine when I covered it. That's led to a lot of questions about the Monroe doctrine as a whole. Lots of people asking about whether it was good or bad. It depends on what century you're in. The other thing is that it gets referred to in the past tense, primarily because it's one of the oldest American foreign policy doctrines. But the truth is, the Monroe Doctrine never really went away. It evolved, it expanded, it reversed. And for nearly 200 years, it's been one of the most powerful justifications the United States has ever used to project power beyond its borders, especially down south. And what's interesting is that it didn't start as a threat. It started as a warning. In 1823, the United States was young, fragile really. It was still figuring out whether it could survive as a nation or fracture into something else. Most of Latin America had just broken free from European colonial empires. Spain was weakened, Portugal was strained, and the great monarchies of Europe were looking across the Atlantic, wondering if they could reclaim what they'd lost. President James Monroe went before Congress and said in the simplest of terms, the Western Hemisphere is no longer open for European colonization. Any attempt by European powers to expand their control in the Americas would be seen as a hostile act against the United States. At the time, it wasn't bluster. It was a gamble, an almost delusional one. The U.S. didn't really have the military power to enforce that warning by itself. Not even close. What made it work was the British Navy, which also didn't want rival European empires gaining ground in the Americas. The United States declared the rule. Britain made it real. Originally, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't about domination. It was about distance, about keeping old world empires out of the new world. I think most people watching this would agree that's an objectively good thing. But it's foreign policy. It's not about good and evil. It's about power. And here's the thing about power. Once you claim a sphere of influence, every generation finds a way to stretch what that claim means. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Monroe Doctrine was no longer just about stopping European colonization. It became a justification for U.S. intervention anywhere south of our borders. Then came the Roosevelt corollary in 1904. Theodore Roosevelt added a new layer. The United States wouldn't just keep Europe out. It would also reserve the right to intervene in Latin American nations if it believed instability threatened U.S. interests. That's the moment the doctrine truly flipped, from a shield into a lever of power. From that point on, the U.S. treated much of the Western Hemisphere not as independent equals, but as a managed neighborhood. The U.S. was the obnoxious HOA, but with a lot more infantry. This is where the history gets uncomfortable. The Monroe Doctrine and its offshoots were used to justify U.S. military occupations all over down there. It was used to rationalize the overthrow of governments seen as unfriendly to U.S. economic or political interests. It shaped Cold War interventions, And honestly, it created much of the instability we see down there today. In a bizarre twist, the people cheering on a revitalized Monroe Doctrine constantly complain about the migration that occurs because of the destabilization caused by it. Each time the U.S. stuck its nose into something, the official reasoning sounded different. It was communism, instability, national security, whatever. But the underlying logic stayed consistent. The Western Hemisphere was treated as a strategic zone that the United States believed it had a right to manage. And from the perspective of many countries in Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine stopped looking like protection from Europe and started looking like domination by Washington. Of course it did. The U.S. was knocking over countries for bananas. During the Cold War, the Monroe Doctrine took on a new life. This time, it wasn't about European empires. It was about the Soviet Union. The logic went like this. Any socialist or communist movement in the Americas was no longer just a local political shift in a sovereign nation. It was a potential beachhead for a rival superpower. That framework shaped U.S. policy for decades. It influenced coups. It influenced proxy wars. It influenced brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. And in many places, it left deep scars that still shape politics today. For people living under those interventions, the doctrine didn't feel like protection. It felt like something imposed. A distant power deciding which governments were acceptable and which weren't. You know, one of the primary reasons for our own revolution. A lot of people assumed the Monroe Doctrine ended with the Cold War, that it faded out once the Soviet Union collapsed. It didn't. U.S. leaders still reference it when talking about foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere. China investing in ports, Russia forming alliances, Iran expanding diplomatic ties. All of it tends to get filtered through the same old lens. This is our neighborhood. The language is more careful now. The tone is more diplomatic, but the logic remains. The Western Hemisphere is treated not as neutral ground, but as a strategic space where outside powers are viewed with suspicion. The doctrine, in other words, isn't a relic. It's the standard operating procedure, even today. Here's the tension that always sat at the corner of the Monroe Doctrine. On one hand, it claims to defend sovereignty, to prevent powerful foreign empires from imposing themselves on weaker nations. On the other hand, it has repeatedly been used to justify the United States imposing itself on those same nations. It speaks the language of freedom while practicing the mechanics of control. That contradiction is why different people remember the Monroe Doctrine so differently. In the U.S., it's often taught as a bold declaration of hemispheric freedom. In much of Latin America, it's remembered as the myth America told itself while intervening again and again. Both interpretations exist because both are true. The deeper lesson of the Monroe Doctrine isn't really about diplomacy. It's about what happens when a nation gets strong enough to redraw the rules of its environment. At first, power is defensive. Then it becomes stabilizing. Then it starts to feel entitled. That's where the U.S. is today. That's why people actually believe the American mythology that the U.S. doesn't need its allies. The United States didn't invent that pattern. Every empire follows some version of it. What makes the Monroe Doctrine unique is how openly it declared a sphere of influence and, how long that claim has endured. The Monroe Doctrine began as a warning to Europe. Over time, it became a promise the United States made to itself, that this hemisphere would never be just another region in the global balance of power. That promise shaped wars. It shaped economies. It shaped governments. And it shaped how millions of people experienced American power. Not through speeches, but through soldiers, advisors, sanctions, and covert operations. Understanding the Monroe Doctrine isn't about understanding a date or a president. It's about understanding how ideas outlive the people who create them. How a single line in a speech can grow into a guiding logic for generations. And it's about recognizing that history never really ends. It just changes the language it uses to justify the same old struggles over influence, control, and sovereignty. So there you go. A little more information, a little more context, and having the right information will make all the difference. Y'all have a good day.